Hi everyone. The next topic we're going to look at are graded potentials. Hopefully by now you have a good understanding of what a membrane potential is, the difference in charge between the inside and outside of a cell. Here we're going to look at a special type of change in a membrane potential. Before we go forward, I want to talk about some terms that we're going to use today. I'm going to use presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron. The presynaptic neuron is the neuron that's sending a signal, and the postsynaptic neuron is the neuron that's receiving the signal. And between them, remember, is that synapse. We're going to talk about chemically gated channels, and we've covered chemically gated channels before. Neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters are often the chemicals that open those chemically gated channels. And then we're going to use depolarizing and hyperpolarizing. So when we were talking about membrane potential, we talked about it being polar, how the outside charge is positive and the inside charge is negative. Here we're talking about depolarizing. So if that difference is what makes something polar, having a positive and a negative end, depolarizing is going to be taking away that difference. And hyperpolarizing is going to be increasing that difference. We also are going to talk about EPSPs and IPSPs. E stands for excitatory, so it makes a neuron excited, more likely to send a signal. And I stands for inhibitory, which makes a neuron less likely to send a signal. And then we're going to talk about the topic of summation. So here is a picture of some neurons, and we have the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, and we can see an action potential is coming down this axon. And right here we have the axon terminal, and this is that synapse, the space between the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron and the cell body or the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. So a graded potential is a potential that occurs in the dendrites or the soma of a postsynaptic neuron. It has a very short duration, so it doesn't last very long. It's localized, so it doesn't go very far. And its magnitude is determined by the strength of the stimulus. We're going to take some time breaking this down. And we're focusing today on synaptic potentials, but there are many different types of graded potentials, and we'll be able to touch on some of those as we go through the semester. So, at the end of an axon terminal, when the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse, that neurotransmitter is going to bind to a chemically gated channel. And that channel is going to open and allow movement of ions inside and outside of the cell. Here we see a graph of what those movements can look like. So some potentials are going to depolarize the cell membrane, the difference between the inside and the outside of the cell membrane. And so when we see that, we see this increase, this movement towards threshold. And some graded potentials are going to decrease the likelihood of an action potential. And so they're going to move away from threshold. So we have depolarizing over here and hyperpolarizing over here. Both of these graded potentials have special names. EPSP is the shortened version of excitatory postsynaptic potentials. So as I mentioned before, excitatory postsynaptic potentials make it more likely for an action potential to occur. So it's going to bring the cell closer to threshold. And another way of explaining what happens there is that it depolarizes the cell membrane. The opposite, the IPSPs, are inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. They are going to pull the membrane potential away from negative 70 millivolts going down, hyperpolarizing the cell membrane. This makes it less likely for an action potential to occur. Now, in the beginning, I mentioned that the magnitude of a graded potential is directly related to the strength of the stimulus. And so there are two different ways that a stimulus can be strong. Action potentials are always the same. So action potentials just do what they do. They send the signal down the axon, they release neurotransmitters. How does a neuron get louder? Well, it sends many action potentials very quickly, one right after another. And that is called temporal summation. Okay, so one way that a neuron knows that it's getting a really important message is if it gets a lot of messages in rapid succession from one neuron. Another way that a neuron knows that there's a lot of information coming in, a lot of important information coming in, is if multiple neurons are sending action potentials. And that is called spatial summation. So temporal summation, again, is the frequency of action potentials coming from one presynaptic neuron. And spatial summation is that the situation when multiple neurons are sending action potentials to the postsynaptic cell. So with both excitatory and inhibitory graded potentials coming in, you may be wondering, how do you get to the point of threshold? Well, if you get far more excitatory or EPSPs coming in than IPSPs, and it reaches that negative 55 millivolts, you've reached threshold and an action potential will occur. The next video is going to go over what happens during an action potential, so stay tuned.